So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce today Ihor Poshyvalio, a colleague of ours who has come all the way from Kyiv in Ukraine, and he is the Deputy Director General of the Ivan Honchar Museum and National Center of Folk Culture in Kyiv, Ukraine, and he will talk about the battle for the future, armed conflict, and heritage in Ukraine. Ihor?
Thank you, Corinne. Good afternoon. It is my great pleasure to be here with you today and to share some of our challenges we faced lately and some of our experience we gained in the course of the last 2 years in Ukraine. Let me start my presentation with words by Daniel Sheehy, former acting director of the Smithsonian Center for Folk Life and Cultural Heritage, who argued that an unprecedented worldwide acceleration of social change outpaced time-honored values and practices, eroding their currency. In this way, cultivation of multicultural respect and mutual understanding between nations and countries and communities, as well as raising the role of and capacity of local leaders in cultural emergency preparedness and response, can be among timely solutions to the biggest challenges and threats of the 21st century. As Hans Martin Hinz, ICOM president, stated at his recent lecture in Kyiv, it is important that museums are transforming into places of reconciliation with the past and between conflict parties, but without attempts to harmonize the history. Today, museums help us to reconstruct the past, reflect on the fundamental values, and provide a background essential for the reconciliation of society and the understanding of the present. According to Australian museologist Caroline Turner, museums in our contemporary globalized world are far more than repositories of the history of nations or single national narratives. They reflect culture in its broadest sense and diverse community concerns, as well as transnational ideas. Ukraine, a peaceful nation since World War II, is no longer excluded from this. The country today faces numerous challenges and threats. The genocide policy of the communists in Ukraine and the cultural oppression of the 20th century resulted in the considerable loss of historical memory for Ukrainians. For our nation, charting a distinctive course into the future, peace, and to the democratic united society requires some memory, who we have been. The events of the winter 2013-2014 in Ukraine have provided this need as never before. Demonstrations and civil unrests began with public protests demanding closer European integration. They were fueled by the perception of the widespread government corruption, abuse of power, and violation of human rights. This demonstrated a social responsibility, a real hunger for civic and community engagement, patriotism, and a burst of cultural activism. According to Paul Globe, a longtime specialist on ethnic and religious issues in Eurasia, a new nation was born in Ukraine, defined by common political faith in democracy and freedom. He feels that the very name of the Ukrainian nation-forming experience, the Maidan or square, calls to mind the public space, or agora, where the Athenians came together in classical times and elaborated the principles of rule by the people. In 1961, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev declared that Russian rockets would destroy the Acropolis in Athens if necessary to promote Russian aims. And Ukrainians, by their courage and determination, according to Goebel, have proved that the Greek prime minister was right when he replied to the Kremlin dictator that Moscow might, with its weapons, be able to destroy the Acropolis, but that it would fail to destroy the ideas of democracy and human freedom that were born there. On December the 1st, 2013, my colleague and friend Linda Norris from upstate New York issued a post: "If I ran a museum in Kyiv right now," in her blog, The Uncatalogued Museum. It was a prompt transatlantic and transcultural response of the museum expert, well known in Ukraine for her activities as a Fulbright scholar, to the riot police night attack on the peaceful protesters, mostly students, in Kyiv. In the post, Linda puts herself in a Ukrainian museum director's shoes and offers an action program in 3 spheres, representing community values and ethics, serving the community, and collecting. Indeed, this is a natural and seemingly common response for a community leader or leadership of the American or European Western museum, a museum which is about, for, and with people. But for me, in the context of revolutionary events in Kyiv, the word combination, a museum with people, gained quite new and special meaning. This seems quite clear and even a banal phrase, but is it common for Ukraine and other post-Soviet countries? Do our museums, their leadership and staff, really want, can, and know how to be with people today and protect their dignity and cultural property? This especially in a period of social uprisings and political tensions, in unusual situations, which require from the museum staff an open, honest look into the eyes and minds of their visitors and communities they represent. It happened historically that most museums in Ukraine are state-run, and therefore they deeply depend upon the government, ideologically, financially, administratively. So how they should behave in a deep conflict between authorities and society? Should they be neutral or at least pretend to be neutral? As David Fleming, director of National Museums Liverpool, discussed at his keynote speech at the AM meeting in Seattle last May, exploring the roles of modern museums, how political they are, and does this pose a threat or opportunity? I hope for many museums the answer is theoretically obvious. The same as for the army and riot police soldiers who took the oath to serve the people. 2 Ukrainian museums remain indifferent observers of the breathtaking and world-covered events on the Maidan. How they can be responsive and inclusive to the needs of the society and communities they represent and serve to. How they can be effective in protecting cultural heritage they keep and represent. The voice of the museum community was not that loud, but was quite distinct. In Kyiv, a dozen museums made their public statement, opened its doors to protesters, and proposed them tea, shelter, rest, and cultural programs. The Ivan Honchar Museum, in which I currently work, shifted its educational programs to Maidan. We launched a series of educational programs, flash mobs, folk celebrations, and performances in the epicenter of protests during that restless Christmas time. In fact, that event became a great chance for many museums to test their leadership and connections to their communities. I witnessed this need in the twinkling eyes of peaceful protesters during those 3 months. And I jumped into conclusion that to be with the people, our museums and cultural institutions should not necessarily do extraordinary things. And this idea was brightly shown up in further unfolding events on Maidan. Let me focus on a few case studies, and one about two museums which happened to be in the epicenter of events. In January 2014, a number of cultural institutions located in the very downtown of Ukraine's capital found themselves at the epicenter of street battles. The cultural heritage, as well as the people, became the hostages of the escalating political standoff. About 1,500 feet, a 6-minute walk, is the physical distance between two neighboring museums, which in the emergency situations had displayed a much bigger gap in their leadership potential, preparedness strategies, emergency response, and of course, the damage suffered. Ironically, in the 1950s, the facade landmark of the National Art Museum, the biggest museum in Ukraine, was a Soviet tank installed on a pedestal. 65 years later, a metal catapult constructed to send flaming projectiles at police lines, but endangering museum building and its collections, took this honored place to celebrate the victory and creativity of the protesters. On January 16th, the anti-protest laws which fueled the riot were passed by the parliament, and next days severe clashes with Molotov cocktails, stones, rubber bullets, tear gas, and flash grenades began. The riot police completely blocked the streets alongside the museum building, refusing to create a ceasefire corridor and escort museum visitors, including children, attending art studio to safety place. It took the museum leadership time and efforts to negotiate and finally evacuate the visitors. And funny, it is telling that the children had to show their freshly painted drawings to police as evidence of their non-connection to the protesters. The next day, the riot police set up a camp on the museum territory and even lit bonfires directly on the steps of its neoclassical 19th century building, trying to stay warm in the cold. In a few days, museum workers responded, and they demounted exhibits on the first floor, which included the most precious artworks, and evacuated them to safer locations. A few huge paintings were left on the walls, carefully wrapped. Some extra safety measures were taken. In that dramatic scenery, the museum leadership tried to stay in a good humor. For example, disseminating the picture of protesters in clashes with riot police in clouds of smoke and fire in front of the museum, facade with the caption, "When Ukrainians want to visit the museum, nobody can stop them." Being aware that without establishing communication with the surrounding military, they could hardly achieve their goals in protecting the collections, the museum, at the very beginning of the events, organized a guided tour for the soldiers, trying to raise the awareness on the nation's cultural heritage and to make personal bridge between museum staff and the soldiers. The museum did simple but useful things, secured the collections, building and staff, prepared important documentation for evacuation, controlled the entrances and exits, kept the guard and emergency man in the building, also it was not easy in that period, and organized a 24-hour duty schedule. A kit depicted a plan of the protest area, including the art museum, with a bed in it and a title, a director of the museum who stays 24 hours there. Luckily, the museum survived and was opened to public a few weeks after the presidential fled. A bright handmade poster, "We are open, National Art Museum," appeared on the barricade. The next case study, a story of the Kyiv City History Museum, did not have such a happy end. This museum was challenged 10 years ago before when it was moved from the 19th century Klovsky Palace, a very nice building, to the former Lenin Museum, which was lately renamed into Ukrainian House Cultural Center. And the collection of over 250,000 objects found itself in a very unsuitable premises. And it was exposed to extreme vulnerability when the authorities permitted the military to enter the premises when riots started. At about midnight, the alarm was set off and museum administration informed law enforcement about the emergency, but no one responded, as well as the Ministry of Culture. In the morning, employees arrived to find the museum holdings ransacked. The office computers were destroyed, as well as the storage doors. Many items, including icons, old printed books, pieces of 18th century porcelain, appeared to have been stolen, while a greater quantity of exhibits had been broken or strewn across the floor. The same morning, evacuation was carried out spontaneously, using limited resources and engaging museum people, cultural activists, volunteers, and private donors. It should be mentioned that the museum staff itself was in shock, lacking strong leadership, emergency planning, and response strategies in this crisis situation. In this situation, it is important to note that the Ukrainian Committee of the Blue Shield was founded on February 21st as a public response to the situation in the country. And they managed to stop a chaotic wave of damage, the Soviet-era monuments in Kyiv, and helped to clean up rooms and evacuate the Kyiv City Museum collection items and equipment. In partnerships with so-called Samoborona, or self-defense platoon, they provided a 24-hour monitoring and patrol in the capital's downtown. They also initiated work of the expert group to protect cultural property from looting and vandalism at the official presidential residency, Mezhigirya, and transport the artworks for temporary storage to the National Art Museum. Another example of social activism can be seen in another initiative, Maidan Museum. In order to preserve artifacts displaying in different ways, the unprecedented movement, a few museums and NGOs launched in January 2014 a joint project, the Maidan Museum, which has been recently expanded by the Museum of Freedom Initiative. The group of cultural activists collected objects and stories from the camp, which will form part of the window into Ukraine and tell more about the protest movement from perspective of not only historical and dramatic events, but bunches of art expressions, creativity, humor, and satire as a powerful voices and arms of the communities. Another case study, the hybrid war as a challenge of the 21st century. It should be mentioned that lately Ukrainian cultural heritage is facing not only inner but external threats. With annexation of Crimea in March 2013, Ukraine lost all cultural property on the peninsula, including the ancient city of Tauritic Khersones and its Ihor in Sevastopol, which was inscribed to the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2013. Another masterpiece from the list, the National Sanctuary Complex Sofia of Kyiv, a historical preserve that contains a complex of museums, has lost its branch, the Genoese fortress in Sudak. Ukraine have taken responsibility for protecting these outstanding heritage sites, but now can hardly commit this. The military conflict in eastern Ukraine since spring 2014 is another major threat to cultural institutions and heritage sites there. Before occupation, of the eastern regions. The Ukrainian Ministry of Culture representatives visited their endangered museums and advised their directors to close exhibitions and take safety precautions and enact emergency planning. Unlike the Donetsk Art Museum, the Donetsk Local Law Museum ignored the recommendations, and in August 2014, almost 30 galleries were damaged by 8 shells, and most collections were reported to be lost. And in this situation, it is amazing how, practically under fire, local residents helped the museum staff to save valuable items. Local communities quickly self-organized and responded. Interesting that by saving museum property, the volunteers were healing themselves in that complicated environment, admitting that this activity became a distraction for people. There is a large number of museums, archaeological sites, historical sites, and monuments which are in the epicenter of military conflict in Donbass right now. One of examples, Savur Mohyla, the World War II memorial obelisk, collapsed after enduring weeks of heavy shelling. The building of the Luhansk Local Law Museum was also damaged in artillery fire. The precise number of archaeological sites and architectural monuments, museum collections, and heritage sites damaged or under threat is still unknown. Currently, Ukraine has no information and no access to the occupied territory. In this situation, the role of communities and leaders is of a special importance. On a volunteer base, a working group of museum experts was formed at the Ministry of Culture. As a member of this working museum rescue group, I must admit that we have not enough knowledge, experience, and resources to provide our mission systematically and skillfully enough. Last fall, we have organized a workshop by museum employees who participated in the ICROM training in Moldova and shared the gained knowledge and experience with over 30 participants from the endangered regions. We learned many things about disaster and risk management and implemented some simple but important steps according to ICROM recommendations in museums. As a head of the Museum Council at the Ministry of Culture, I worked with council members over strategic priorities for culture in Ukraine affected by conflict. This spring, I had the privilege of participating in the First Aid to Cultural Heritage training course in the Netherlands, organized by ICROM, the Smithsonian Institution, UNESCO, and local national partners. The course has really empowered over 20 participants from all over the world with contemporary visions, comprehensive knowledge, and practical tools in cultural emergency response. 4 weeks in Amsterdam did even more, sharing professionalism and passion of the renowned trainers from all the continents and establishing a global network of devoted cultural activists. The US Embassy in Ukraine and the Prince Claus Fund has also provided me with another opportunity to share the gained experience back home within another capacity building project. In conclusion, I would like to stress that almost 2 years ago, millions of Ukrainians bravely fought for their cultural identity and national dignity, and hundreds of them heroically died for the democratic values. Our cultural heritage was severely endangered by mass protests and clashes with the government, corrupted government, annexation of its territory, and the military conflict in its eastern regions. We were ready to die for our independence and values, but not ready to protect our communities, our cultural heritage, our territory. In saving museum collections and heritage sites from vandalism, looting and shelling, in working out emergency response plans, in creating recovery strategies, in creating networks of devoted cultural activists, we were mostly driven by our enthusiasm, intuition, social responsibility, passion to our cultural heritage, and the support, of course, of our foreign colleagues. What we have done was quite a lot, but not enough. Our international colleagues have provided expertise and shared generously energy to make us more strong and effective. Why is this important? As Corinne Wegner and Marianne Ortiz stated, the choice is ours. If we continue to act as individuals and function within a variety of discrete organizations, we will almost certainly fail the next time colleagues in a war-torn country need us. However, if we unite, we can make our voices heard and perhaps even be influential enough to prevent the next time. This particular particular moment in the Ukrainian history displays a critical need for Ukrainian cultural activists to gain new skills in empowering and inspiring local leadership, creating spaces and opportunities for Ukrainian citizens, not just to be spectators, but participants in the ideas and questions that shape and protect art and history, and the past and the future. As envisioned by Marshall McLuhan, there are no passengers on spaceship Earth. We are all crew. Thank you for your attention. And it's my pleasure to introduce my discutant, Kirk Cordell, Executive Director of the National Center for Preservation, Technology and Training of the National Park Service.
Thank you. You want to stay up here? I think we're going to have some things to share together rather than have you sit, unless you would rather sit. As I said, I'm Kirk Cordell. I'm the Director of the U.S. National Park Service's National Center for Preservation, Technology and Training. And I couldn't help but be struck the first time I read Ihor's excellent paper about how different his experiences are from the experiences that we have had so many of. The National Park Service provides at least some technical assistance to governments all over the world to help them with threatened resources and resources that have been damaged by natural disasters and other challenges. And within the United States, we have a lot more experience with assisting agencies and localities that have had their resources damaged by earthquakes and fires and floods and all those kinds of things, since we're the principal providers of cultural resource staff to FEMA and to the Coast Guard and to other agencies under ESF 11 and other protocols that allow us to provide our staff to go help folks out under those circumstances. In my own center, NCPTT has participated in quite a number of projects to help address resources that have been damaged. We've participated with FEMA in recovery from almost too many hurricanes to count now. We heard earlier today how much more frequent those are coming, and we've worked on the Gulf oil spill with the Coast Guard as well. But I think it's kind of difficult for us to wrap our minds around the experience of having actually an existential threat to our own staff or to our resources that you've been dealing with here. And so I was thinking as I was coming in today that we're just celebrating this year the sesquicentennial of the end of the Civil War, the United States Civil War, and it's really been 150 years since we really had to consider what it would be like to have our cultural institutions threatened by military intervention. And so I just found the stories that you presented in the examples to be stories of courage and crisis quite inspirational today. So I just had a few follow-up questions. I thought since we had you here that rather than me talking a lot about myself and what we do, that I should try to extract some more ideas out of you, because I thought some of your points were quite intriguing. So First of all, you noted that museums are no longer simply passive repositories, but you said they're important communication facilities, they're community engagement centers, and they're guardians of a nation's memory and identity, and they're places of reconciliation. And so I guess my question for you today would be, what steps should museum directors and boards be taking today to move their institutions closer to fulfilling all of those roles?
Thank you so much for this thoughtful question. I think the first step is for the museum leadership, and especially for the director, is to share authority with the community and to let people be engaged into a lot of museum activities, into shaping the programs, into shaping exhibitions, and in making closer connections with the local communities. It is quite a new thing in Ukrainian environment and in museum sphere. It's quite typical for American museums, but for us in Ukraine and in many post-Soviet countries, this is something new, because mostly museums impose to the society, to their potential and real visitors, their programs, their ideas, their visions, even sometimes and often political agenda. So in this situation, to attract community, to make community the most important tool, not only for improving and financial health, but also to protect in emergency situations, because no authority, no ministry, no official can be as helpful in emergency situation as local communities. And in this sense, it's so important.
And fortunately, we're being hosted today by a museum system that has taken a lot of steps in that direction, I think. So, you also stated that under the repressive Soviet regime that museums were explicitly places of propaganda. And it made me wonder, how did Ukrainian museums persuade the public after independence and during the recent conflict that they're not now just the voices of a different master, but they're outlets for multiple voices and viewpoints?
It's the process of shifting from the places of propaganda to community centers is still ongoing in Ukraine, because it's not easy, because of lack of philosophy, lack of knowledge, lack of political will, and a lot of directors in Ukrainian museums are still from that era, and they are very reluctant for a change and transition. They are reluctant to make their museums really matter in the society, in the communities. And in this point, it's so important that many museums, mostly in big cities, they start changing exhibitions. They tried and included a lot of multiple voices into their exhibits, into their programs, enlarging number of visitations and inviting foreign partners, organizing workshops, training people and the staff how to be today responsive, how to be timeliness to today's problems and challenges, how to make museum really matter in today's not so simple but very challenging and threatening life.
Thank you. One of the major points of your paper was that museums have a major role to play in preserving cultural identity and cultural memory. And I wondered, was this mostly true of historical museums and folk art museums, or are there other types of museums as well? And then sort of related to that, how did they deal with Soviet-era art and history and seeking to promote healing?
In Ukraine, we have a great number of so-called local law museums, mostly everywhere, in every big city, in town. They are regional local law museums. And their exhibits cover different topics, also cultural, natural history, and mostly this kind of museums were tools for propaganda. And right now they are changing their exhibits and trying to be responsive and contemporary, trying to be objective in what they are showing to people. And in this connection, not only folk art museums are keeping their national identity, cultural identity, but this kind of museums as well.
Great, thank you. You also made an important point about museums being about and for and with people, and suggested that the with people portion of that trio had a new and special meaning in the context of the revolutionary events in Kyiv. So I want to know, how would you suggest that museum directors in post-Soviet countries become more with the people? Is the focus more on human rights? Is it more on cultural identity? And how does a museum maintain an independent voice when it is dependent, like as you said, ideologically, economically, and administratively on the government?
It was a big challenge for many museum, not only museum directors, but the museum staff, because many people didn't know how to react in a situation when rights protests started against the government. And most museums are governmentally funded, and in many museums, especially national museums, the directors are appointed by the government. So these people are very, very dependent upon the government. And when protests started, a lot of museums issued open statements, and some of them were taken to investigators' offices, asking what they think and how they plan to behave further. So there were definite threats in this transitional period. And we know stories about the metro driver who helped people, who directed people, passengers, which way will be the best to join the protesters in the central area because some stations were blocked. And this person was fired from the job, and a lot of even riot police officers and soldiers who rejected to take part in suppressing the protests were also fired. So there were some signs of repressions, but many directors were quite shy and their voice was not very loud. But I think with time, this was a kind of a test time for many, many of us. And I'm so happy that still we have a core of museum professionals, including museum directors, who today are this leading tank for bringing change to Ukraine.
Thank you. And then if museum directors, staff, or boards see human threats rising, whether that's from civil unrest or from military activity, what are the most important steps that they need to take to protect their collections and turn their hearts towards their people, like you've been suggesting?
It is so important today for us not only to tell about the past, but to tell about the present, from the position present, but about the future. And the initiative I mentioned about, this new type of museums, so-called museums of memory, museum of consciousness, they start to appear in Ukraine just in concept, because it is important to us, for us not to speak safely about the safely past, but to speak about the future from today's point of view, and to make the collections of this kind of museums relevant to today's generations and to the future generations. And we also learn, with the help of our museum collections, to be inclusive, how to make objects speak, because previously, in Soviet periods, objects had no voices. They were only aesthetical point of view was exhibited. No people, no context in general, but just object and that's all. So today, the museums try to be objects and content-centered and people-centered. And this is a big challenge for Ukrainian museum sphere today.
Okay, thank you. And then the last question is both for you and it's for us, and that is at the very end of your paper, you had an excellent list of next steps that you thought needed to be undertaken. And I wondered which of those you thought were going to present you the biggest challenge, and then how can those of us in the room help you meet that challenge?
The biggest challenge, I think, in this kind of steps, which are in my paper, but I did not speak about them, is how to get rid of totalitarian mentality, how to be open, friendly, and how to depend upon your colleagues, upon the communities. Because even participating in events like this not only empowers with some practical tools, but also provides, as for me, some energy to come back and make some change. This is so important. Because a lot of people in Ukraine, they still wait for something. They just need to look for some instructions from above. But right now, no instruction. The government, in this situation, because of lack of funding and lack of resources and quite different priorities, they're very, very passive. And this situation is very nice, on the other hand, for us to cultivate our leadership qualities, to organize people around us. And our foreign colleagues help us to encourage how to make networks, real networks, not formal networks, but networks which are effective, which respond immediately, which engage people not formally, not on paper, but in real life. This is very important and timeless solution for our first aiders in Ukraine today.
All right, thank you. I think if we can bring the lights up, we still have time for some audience questions. So you're welcome.
Hi, thank you so much. Your speech was incredible, and I really congratulate you on your efforts during a very volatile time. My name is Priyanka. I'm a fellow at the Freer Sackler, and I look at heritage preservations and minority rights in India. And my question, you talked a little bit about Crimea, but I was wondering, for you, what were the challenges and some of the opportunities that you were able to talk about, the multiple narratives and minority rights during a very volatile time, because the Crimean Tatars have a very interesting history. So I was wondering specifically how, given the volatile situation, how, you talk so much about supporting the people of Ukraine, but how also are the different narratives and different agendas and heritage and memory of people coming forward within the work that you do? Thank you.
Thank you so much for this important question. In fact, the cultural heritage of Crimean Tatars, in particular, is severely endangered in Crimea. And speaking about the leadership, local leadership, I can provide you with one example of Rustem Skibin, a Tatar artist, who has created a kind of ecological village, or he turned his house into an authentic dwelling. And he provided this platform for discussions, for masterclasses, to make the cultural heritage living in Crimea. And he just completed all this just before the annexation happened. But he was lucky to bring everything, almost everything, his collection to Ukraine, to Kyiv. And right now we're looking for some other place for him to start what was important for him back home. And it is also important that many museums, including my museums, we support Crimean Tatars in many, many initiatives. And we organized at least two exhibitions on Crimean Tatars immediately after annexation of Crimea, because we have seen some parallels of annexation which took place in 18th century and in 21st century. And the support is so important to them, and we feel this because interesting example. On that exhibition we asked Crimean Tatars what did the attitude towards Ukraine changed after Crimea was annexed, and many of them admitted that they absolutely changed their views. Even speaking about the flag, even the symbol of Ukrainian nation. They said, we never paid attention to Ukrainian flags in Crimea Peninsula before. But when we saw how the flags were turned down or burned down, the flags became something very valuable for them as well. And so Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, we share common values today, and we have common threats. And right now I'm very pleased to connotate that we are uniting to preserve our cultural heritage in different spheres today. Any questions? Yes, please.
Thanks very much. I want to refer back to something that was spoken about yesterday, and that was the use of cosmetics in Haiti. It's a slightly different story, but let me start there. When the extermination camps were being liberated in Germany and Poland, mostly Poland after the Second World War, a box of lipsticks arrived in the aid. And nobody knew how this mistake happened. It was clearly a mistake. But women prisoners who had no clothes, were starving, no food, enthusiastically used the lipsticks. And this is written up, and it's one extraordinary source for this. If anyone, you probably all know Banksy, the artist, he's used this story in one of his books. And the letter that was written by one of the liberators of the camp is in the War Museum, in Imperial War Museum in London, who describes this. And the interpretation of this is the great significance of self-esteem for people, even in the most desperate of desperate circumstances. The actual act, being able to feel that you're applying something to yourself which gives you an identity, was so important for people. Now I'm going to take a big leap from that to say that actually when we're talking about culture, it's often about establishing your identity and having a sense of common purpose with others who share that identity or creating that identity collectively. And the cases that we've heard here, China, Ukraine, in this room, we all have a very clear idea of what is right and what is wrong. We can see that. But if we were Russian, we would have the opposite sense of what was right and wrong. And if we were German in Germany in the 1930s and 40s, we would have a completely different sense of what was right and wrong. And indeed, in many wars, both sides think that God is on their side. The point I'm wanting to make here is that if we truly want to understand culture, then we can't pick our sides. We have to understand how culture is operating on all sides, and especially where culture is actually embedded in different people in the same place. In my written paper, I refer to the Babri Mosque in India, which was destroyed by Hindu cultural nationalists. This is typical, and we've heard other stories about this here in the conference, is that the identity, the sense of identity becomes a weapon of conflict and war, but we can't pick sides. I mean, of course, we do pick sides. We, in this room, we all know what we would support. But we have to have an understanding of why people fight for ISIS. Why do young men and women go from Britain to join this appalling war? And I think that's basically what I'm saying, is that understanding that is crucially important. And one tool that we have for both understanding that and perhaps trying to do a bit of prevention is what has been called preventive diplomacy, which was started within the UN system 50 years ago. I know very little about it, but it seems to me that that is an area in which we might think about working to protect cultural heritage, is to see what aspect of preventive diplomacy helps us identify before a conflict happens as to how we might protect it by engaging with how we might say, well, this is a common culture. You don't have to take your side on this and destroy it, because it can be a common culture.
Thank you, Ihor. That was a great presentation and very thoughtful presentation. Many, many points. But I'm going to ask you one very focused question. And that is, when you showed us those images where people had been taking out, evacuating objects and all, it was not very clear which area it was. Maybe I missed that. Perhaps you would. And the second question is, the very act of evacuating objects or very act of moving them, salvaging or doing these kind of things, how do you think, as a museum professional, that relates to building a spirit for, like it rallies people around the cause of heritage, or it builds social cohesion? Would you care to shed some light on that? How do you think? What is your experience about that?
Thank you, Aparna, for this question. Speaking about that case study, the evacuation, it was something new, and for Ukraine, it was very spontaneous action. It took place at the Kyiv City History Museum. Because the museum leadership, unlike the National Art Museum, was very passive, they didn't know what to do, they were in shock. And the collection was badly endangered. They have a storage, not exposition galleries, but storage on the 4th and 5th floor. And that's why in this situation, when many people, activists and the Blue Shield activists and representatives of some museum NGO, they learned about this event, because there were a kind of a crew of us. There was a small team of people who monitored 24 hours situation in the capital, especially in the endangered region. And when we learned about this, it was very, very spontaneous action. We should take the most precious objects to safer location. And because this museum had a lot of branches, so it was done not professionally, I can admit, because nobody can guarantee that the trucks and vans with objects can safely go to safer locations. But on the other hand, the museum leadership addressed Kunsttrans professional transportation system. And they officially refused because they cannot guarantee the safety of collections, transportation. And in this situation, what I liked, the response, because a lot of people can just watch. And during the Maidan events, we had activists, we had so-called hundreds, because people were organized according to hundreds. And there were medical hundreds, there were student hundreds, there were people who died heavenly hundreds, and there were so-called sofa 100, people who sit on sofas back home and look from their televisions or internet what's going on around. And so that first actions, they were provided not professionally, but they were at least the first response, the first test of our knowledge, of our even ability to do something or just to look what's going on around us. So in this situation, I think what was later I participated in this fantastic training course, and a lot of things stay on its own places when I analyzed what we did wrong, what we did not wrong. But the quick response was the thing which we were taught, how to respond quickly but professionally, on the other hand as well. Thank you. Thank you.